Hey everyone, this is a piece from Life Without Money, Building Fair and Sustainable Economies, edited by Anitra Nelson and Frans TImmerman. The piece that I'm going to be reading is Money, Markets, and Ecology by John O'Neill. This chapter traces parallels in the history of ecological and socialist economic thought and argues that their future is intertwined because both require rethinking of alternatives to market mechanisms for solving environmental and social problems. The analysis of economic debates involving socialist economists, Austrian economists, ecological economists, and neoclassical economists informs a discussion of non-market associational forms. The potential and limits of the current surge of forms of deliberative democracy is considered. Arguments are made for institutional pluralism within a non-market socialist future, and the significance of critical defenses of existing non-market orders is highlighted. Ecological and socialist thought. The history of ecological and socialist thought over the last century has been more intertwined than is often supposed. In particular, the socialist calculation debates had an environmental dimension that is often overlooked. The objections that Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and other Austrian economists raised against socialism were directed against the tradition of thought that issued in modern ecological economics as well. The precursors of ecological economics, Joseph Popper Linnaeus, Karl Ballard Atlanticus, Otto Neurath, Wilhelm Ostwald, Patrick Geddes, Frederick Soddy, and Ernest Solvay were all included among their targets. In particular, two central assumptions of ecological economics were subject to criticism. First, that social choices have to recognize that economic institutions and relations are embedded within the physical world and subject to resource and ecological constraints, and hence, second, that economic choices cannot be founded on purely monetary valuations. Thus, if the arguments of Mises and Hayek were conclusive against socialism, as many assume, then they have more general implications. They raise problems with the perspectives on ecologically rational choices that emerged in the tradition of ecological economics. Indeed, while their assumptions are very different from those of the neoclassical economists, and in the case of Hayek more powerful, some of the conclusions drawn by the Austrian tradition paralleled neoclassical approaches to environmental problems. For both, the existence of environmental problems is the result of the absence of markets in environmental goods. Their solution lies in the extension of markets to include currently unpriced environmental goods. The common ground between the ecological and socialist traditions lies in their resistance to this market-based approach to social choice. Mises and Hayek were right to see a common opponent. At the same time, the weaknesses in the argument of Mises and Hayek against the ecological tradition are of more general relevance to socialists. It is not just the history of ecological thought and socialist thought that are intertwined. So also is their future. This is not just because any defensible form of socialism will have to be one that is ecologically sustainable, but also because both require the rethinking of alternatives to market mechanisms for solving environmental and social problems. Recent work within the ecological tradition on the use of non-monetary decision tools, the integration of these with deliberative institutions, and the defense of institutional and cultural pluralism address problems central to future models of socialism. Here, the significance of these institutional claims for the future of socialism in the light of the environmental themes in the history of the socialist calculation debates is considered. The received story about socialist calculation presents the debate in terms of a conflict between Mises and then Hayek on the one side and Lange and Taylor on the other. This story is unsatisfactory for three related reasons. First, some of the main characters in the debate are missing, most notably in the context of the ecological themes in the debate, Otto Neurath, one of the central figures in the Vienna Circle. Second, there are more discontinuities in the debates than is often assumed. There were at least two debates that concerned two independent objections to the possibility of socialism. The first debate, to which Mises contributed, was an argument about rational choice and commensurability, specifically the possibility of rational economic action in the absence of a single unit of comparison between alternative economic activities. Neurath's public contribution to the socialist debates was to this earlier phase. The second debate, instigated by Hayek's epistemic objection to socialism, concerned the possibility of planning given the dispersal of knowledge amongst different actors in an economy. While Hayek presents his epistemic argument as a continuation of the first debate, it in fact forms a departure from it. Indeed, Hayek's own position on the nature of rational choice is closer to that of Neurath than that of Mises. Neurath forcibly highlighted the common ground in their positions in his correspondence with Hayek. Third, the ecological dimension to the debate has been subsequently missed. The possibility of economic choices that reflect the resource and environmental conditions of economic activity was central to the debates. Incommensurability, money, and rational choice under socialism. Mises's arguments against the possibility of rational choice in socialism were targeted against two opponents. First, those theorists in some Marxist literature who advocated replacing money as a unit of economic calculation with another unit such as labor time units, and ecological economists such as Popper, Linnaeus, and Ballard Atlanticus, who advocated energy units. Second, Neurath, who denied that rational economic choice required the existence of a single unit of calculation and advocated economic decisions founded on in natura calculation in kind. Mises's arguments against both turn on assumptions about the nature of practical rationality and practical rationality's dependence on commensurability, having a common measure. Rational economic decision-making involving, quote, higher order, end quote, production goods requires a single cardinal measure on the basis of which the worth of alternative states of affairs could be calculated and compared. Environmental examples were already at the center of this debate, although most self-consciously so in the work of Neurath than that of Mises. Thus, for example, given the choice, quote, whether we shall use a waterfall to produce electricity or extend coal and better utilize the energy contained in coal, end quote, we need some way of calculating the advantages and benefits of alternatives, and this in turn required a common unit of measurement. A common cardinal unit of measurement is provided by monetary prices in the market. Quote, calculations based upon exchange values enable us to reduce values to a common unit, end quote. Prices form, indeed, the only adequate unit of comparison. Comparability between options requires monetary prices that measure exchange values such that one is able to have a determinate answer to the advantages of alternatives by way of simple rules. Quote, The practical man, must know whether what he wants to achieve will be an improvement when compared with the present state of affairs and with the advantages to be expected from the execution of other technically realizable projects which cannot be put into execution if the project he has in mind absorbs the available means. Such comparisons can only be made by the use of money prices. End quote. On this view, the non-existence of monetary measures in a socialist economy rules out the possibility of rational economic decisions. Neurath's position is founded on a rejection of this account of rational choice. Rational choice does not need value commensurability. No single measure can capture the multidimensional nature of values employed in social choice. The algorithmic view of practical reason that Mises employs exhibits, quote, pseudo-rationalism, end quote. Our knowledge that informs decision-making is uncertain, and the norms of rationality rarely determine a unique answer given what is known. A proper rationalist recognizes the boundaries of the power of reason in arriving at decisions. Quote, rationalism sees its chief triumph in the clear recognition of the limits of actual insight, end quote. It is a mark of the pseudo-rationalist to believe that there exist technical rules of choice that determine optimal answers to all decisions. Thus, given a choice between alternative sources of energy, say, coal and hydraulic power or solar energy, various ethical and political judgments, for example, about intergenerational equity and the distribution of risks, come into play. One cannot make such choices through a purely technical procedure employing some single unit, either monetary or non-monetary. Neurath did defend the possibility of in natura economy, and indeed the attempt to realize an economy in kind was central to Neurath's socialization plans in the Bavarian Revolution after the First World War. A socialist economy, since it was to consider only the use value of goods, would have to be a non-market, quote, economy in kind, end quote, in which there would exist no role for monetary units to compare options. Quote, we must at last free ourselves from outmoded prejudices and regard a large-scale economy in kind as a fully valid form of economy, which is the more important today in that any completely planned economy amounts to an economy in kind. To socialize, therefore, means to further an economy in kind. To hold on to the split and uncontrollable monetary order, and at the same time to want to socialize, is an inner contradiction. End quote. Otto Neurath. While physical statistics about energy and material use and so on would be needed in such an economy, there would be no need for a single unit of comparison. Quote, there are no units that can be used as the basis of a decision, neither units of money nor hours of work. One must directly judge the desirability of the two possibilities, end quote. In the absence of a single unit of measurement for decision-making, choice requires direct comparisons of alternatives. The consequence is that there is no possibility of excluding political and ethical judgments from even, quote, technical, end quote, decisions. In making this claim, Neurath is not only criticizing the market, but also socialist alternatives to the market that employ single units in making decisions, be these labor hours or energy units. Quote, the question might arise, should one protect coal mines or put greater strain on men? The answer depends, for example, on whether one thinks that hydraulic power may be sufficiently developed or that solar heat might come to be better used, etc. If one believes the latter, one may, quote, spend, end quote, coal more freely and will hardly waste human effort where coal can be used. If, however, one is afraid that when one generation uses too much coal, thousands will freeze to death in the future, one might use more human power and save coal. Such and many other non-technical matters determine the choice of a technically calculable plan. We can see no possibility of reducing the production plan to some kind of unit and then to compare the various plans in terms of such units. End quote. Neurath's response to Mises focuses specifically on a question of the assumptions about economic decision-making that informs Mises's critique. Rational, practical thinking need not involve any single unit that reduces decision-making to a purely technical procedure of calculation. It requires ethical and political decisions. The socialist response to Mises, which still requires a single unit, were mistaken. Quote, even some socialists have agreed with Mises's thesis. Without calculation with one unit, an economy is not possible. Socialism does not acknowledge any calculation with one unit. It follows that socialism is impossible. And therefore, try to establish that in the socialist society there also can be such a calculation. For us, it is essential that calculation in kind in the economic plan has to be the moneyless basis of socialist calculation of economic efficiency. End quote. Neurath. Neurath's arguments against the picture of decision-making that Mises employs turn on specific arguments about the limits of monetary measures and on some more general arguments about the nature of rational choice. The specific argument on the limits of monetary measures turns principally on the inadequacy of monetary measures, or indeed any single measures to capture changes in welfare. First, monetary measures cannot capture adequately the multidimensional nature of welfare concepts, such as standard of living or pleasure. Quote, the attempt to characterize the standard of living are like those which try to characterize the, quote, state of health, end quote. Both are multidimensional structures, end quote. Neurath's arguments go back to a 1912 lecture, The Problem of the Pleasure Maximum, in which Neurath criticizes the assumption that there is a single scale of value according to which options can be uniquely ordered somewhat surprisingly from within a hedonistic perspective. While Neurath defended a social Epicurean position, which takes the goal of social policy to be the increase of happiness understood as pleasure, Neurath rejected the assumption that differences in distinct pleasures, say of listening to music or contemplating a painting, are themselves comparable in terms of some single unit. Hence, there are no units of pleasure on which calculations can be made. This point about the multidimensionality of the concept of standard of living is combined with a second, namely the non-separability of those different dimensions. Quote, we cannot regard, the standard of living, as a weight made up of the sum of the weights of the various parts, end quote. The argument against separability and in defense of a form of holism about values was developed thus by Neurath in an early paper, Remarks on the Productivity of Money. Quote, suppose a civil servant has the choice between two places of residence, A and B. In A, the civil servant receives a larger quantity of food and accommodation. In B, on the other hand, a larger quantity of honor. Is it possible to have a calculus such that it summarizes for us food and accommodation as one magnitude and honor as another? Impossible. We are not able to compute such a complex containing both pleasure and pain by first separately establishing the magnitude of pleasure then the magnitude of pain, and finally doing the sum. On the contrary, we can only look at such a complex as a whole. Therefore, the conversion into money is of no help in this case. The calculus of value reaches its limits, because the value of a sum of goods is not derivable from the sum of the value of the individual goods. Indeed, the question may be raised as whether it is possible to ascertain the value of individual objects in social life without looking at the social life in its entirety at the same time. That is, whether all goods might be complementary. If this is the case, it is impossible to capture the individual phenomenon by separate calculation, independently of whether one uses monetary calculation or any other kind of calculus. End quote. Given that the value of different goods across different dimensions is not separable, an aesthetic model of ascertaining this is preferred to the bookkeeping model. Quote, neither do we compare the artistic achievements of architecture so as to say, this hall is more functional than that one, but less beautiful. Let us add up advantages and disadvantages. In comparing two works of art, we look at one as a whole and the other as a whole. End quote. Otto Neurath. Hayek, Epistemology and Ecology. Hayek's epistemic criticisms of planning are directed, like Mises's criticisms, not just at socialists, but also at attempts in the ecological tradition to understand the ways in which economic institutions are embedded within the physical world, and to develop non-monetary methods for economic choices that recognize those physical preconditions. Hayek denied the possibility of non-monetary units for planning economic production. For Hayek, the ecological tradition exemplified a, quote, scientistic objectivism, end quote, expressed in the, quote, characteristic and ever-recurrent demand for the substitution of in natura calculation for the, quote, artificial, end quote, calculation in terms of price or value. That is, of a calculation which takes explicit account of the objective properties of things, end quote. Neurath became a primary target since his work most clearly combines socialism and in natura calculation. This is why, this is right here, this is me speaking. This is why Otto Neurath has become an important reference point for people who seek to conceptualize socialism with a critique of value in mind. The two people that I can think of offhand that I think are really inspired by Neurath are Aaron Benenev. I think that's how you pronounce his name. I can't remember the vowels in his name. Who I think he wrote the article in EndNotes that was like Misery and Debt. Can't remember, but he's writing a lot. If you watch any of his YouTube videos recently of his lectures and things like that, he's he frequently references Neurath. And the other person who I think who I've noticed references Neurath a lot is Paresh Chattopadhyay, and he said basically something to the effect in one of the essays in one of his books, I believe Socialism and Commodity Production, talks about how for him the two main pillars that like a future conception of socialism should draw on is Anton Pannekoek's Workers' Councils and Otto von Neurath's works on in-kind economy. So Neurath is someone that I feel like he's kind of got a little bit of buzz with some people, but I'm very ignorant of his work, and I'm going to assume that a lot of other people are too. And it's probably something that, these two trusted folks, Benenev and Chattopadhyay, they look to him for inspiration, and we probably should too. At least me. Fuck you guys. You guys do what you want. Just kidding. Don't do what you want. Do what I say. Anyway, the belief in objectivism and in natura calculation for Hayek expresses an illusion about the scope of knowledge that is typified by the social engineer's belief in some purely technical optimal solution to social choices. In holding to the possibility of such an optimum, the social engineer is a victim of the illusion of complete knowledge that underpins the project of socialist planning. It exhibits, quote, Cartesian rationalism, end quote, the belief in the omnipotence of reason and the corresponding failure of, quote, human reason rationally to comprehend its own limitations, end quote. Cartesian rationalism in the social domain fails to acknowledge the division of knowledge in society, the dispersal of practical knowledge embodied in skills and know-how particular to local time and place. Such knowledge cannot be articulated in propositional form and, hence, cannot in principle be passed on to a central planning body. The market, in contrast, resolves problems of ignorance by acting as a coordinating procedure, which distributes to different actors that information that is relevant for the coordination of their plans through the price mechanism. Given this view of the price system, to give up prices for calculation in kind is to give up a solution to the problem of ignorance, for the illusion of the possibility of complete knowledge based in planning. There is no in natura alternative to the monetary measures. How convincing are Hayek's epistemic criticisms of the underpinning of ecological economics? As a criticism of the doctrine that writers like Neurath held, it misses its target. The doctrine that Hayek criticizes, that there are some purely physical units, such as units of energy, independent of human use or belief that could be employed for planning, was rejected by Neurath, and with it the technocratic idea that there is any, quote, optimum, end quote, solution to social problems. Neurath opposed the technocratic movement, which assumes a single optimum solution, quote, with its, quote, optimum happiness, end quote, and which, quote, asks for a particular authority which should be exercised by technicians and other experts in selecting, quote, big plans, end quote, end quote. Neurath's criticisms of technocratic planning start from epistemic assumptions shared with Hayek. Neurath's criticisms of pseudo-rationalism parallel those of Hayek against rationalism. Both reject the illusion of complete knowledge on which technocratic planning is based. Of course, Neurath is not alone in sharing this perspective on the socialist side of the debate. Many socialists have taken Hayek seriously not only because there is power in his epistemic criticisms of central planning, but also because those socialists share common ground with epistemic arguments offered within the socialist tradition. Sorry, what? Let me read that. I think I read it wrong. Many socialists have taken Hayek seriously not only because there is power in his epistemic criticisms of central planning, but also because they share common ground with epistemic arguments offered within the socialist tradition. Hayek's epistemic criticism of centrally planned economies have their counterpart within the history of debates about socialist planning as an argument for democratic and decentralized decision-making, and for a proper appreciation of the limits of abstract technical expertise. There is a long tradition of associational socialism that had argued against the possibility of an economy centralized on Fabian or Bolshevik lines. Similar epistemic themes concerning the importance of local ecological knowledge embodied in particular human practices, the inescapability of social choice in conditions of radical ignorance, and the limits of scientific predictability are central to the ecological tradition. These concerns underpin the need for cultural and institutional pluralism, the precautionary principle, and the importance of deliberative institutions which counter the necessary role of the scientific expert. Castoriadis, sorry, just a side note, Castoriadis in his the content of socialism, one of the three, I'm not sure which one, he proposes the example of like the plan factory, which people with experts calculate options and put them before the public, and the public deliberates on these options. So there's a balance between the expertise, the mathematical and other expertise necessary to coordinate a modern industrial economy, and democratic principles, which for Castoriadis would be a form of radical direct democracy, which is not limited just to the immediate sphere of one's workplace, but extends beyond to the more all-encompassing layers of society, of social life. Anyway, back to the text. The central question that divides Hayek's position from his socialist and ecological opponents is, how far are specifically market institutions either necessary or sufficient to coordinate practical knowledge? Are there alternatives to market solutions to the coordination of knowledge? Associations without the market, theory and practice. Associational models of socialism tend to be associated with the guild socialist movement. Paresh Chattopadhyay has a lot of affirmative things to say about guild socialism. He has an essay about it in one of his books. I'm not sure which one. Actually, I believe it's Socialism and Commodity Production, but I'm not sure. Also, one of the proponents of guild socialism, G.D.H. Cole, has a book out with AK Press titled Libertarian Socialism. Well, he doesn't have a book out. He's a very dead man. But David Goodway has who edited Maurice Brenton's work. He edited a compendium of G.D.H. Cole, the Guild Socialist Thought. I don't know much about G.D.H. Cole, but I know that people I respect respect him. So in light of further evidence, I will respect him as well. Okay. However, Neurath had some sympathy with the emphasis they placed on self-government. Thus, in a review, he wrote, quote, "In Central Europe, we are not sensitive enough to the ideal of self-government. Many people would as much agree to the socialist distribution of housing, food, clothing, education, entertainment, and public health by an army of reliable socialist civil servants as to the self-government of these branches of economy. End quote. That seems correct. That seems correct. If what he's basing this on is the two models of I'm not sure exactly what year he wrote it, but saying whatever, regardless, the two mainstreams being Leninism and social democracy. Um, both of these, both of those systems, both of those currents of thought in regards the content of socialism can very much be encapsulated by what was just said by Neurath. And the only places, the minorities that would have in socialism that might have criticized something like that, for example, I don't know, maybe Rosa Luxemburg, um, uh, and the various anarchists in Central Europe would be very, very marginal. So I think what Ada Neurath just said is correct, but back to the text. However, Neurath rejected the model of socialism offered by the Guild Socialists for two central reasons. First, he rejected their continued acceptance of markets. More generally, he followed the traditional Marxist argument that a market economy in which cooperatives would be forced to compete would not realize a socialist economy. Quote, if after socialization, the individual economic establishments retain far-reaching autonomous rights and exchange commodities and money between themselves, this will amount to engaging in capitalist economic practices. The capitalism of individuals would then be replaced by, quote, capitalism of groups, end quote. Neurath. Or end quote, Neurath. Yes, this seems to be correct insofar as in the book it seems to be correct not because I know anything about Guild Socialism, but because in the book Non-Market Socialism, edited by I believe it was edited by John Crump and Maximilien Rubel, does not include Guild Socialism within the tendencies they cover, and they don't restrict their tendencies, their discussions just to the tendencies that they're most sympathetic to. That book's broken down into like chapter on each like tendency, and so like anarchist communism, for example, and council communism, and Bourdigism and impossibilism all have like chapters. But there's no chapter for Guild Socialism, so that leads me to believe that assessment of Guild Socialism may have some does have some, or is truthful. Second, and less obviously, Neurath also criticized the statism of the models of socialization they offered. Models of socialism they offered. Neurath's associationalism centered more on overlapping functional units of planning rather than units based on national areas. The focus on function rather than area was introduced in his writings after the First World War, in part as a response to the problem of militarism. Quote, in a world socialist society, the fields of life could be linked to each other in the most varied ways, without having to be detachable national units. We might, for instance, reach a stage ... where areas along big navigable rivers would form one administrative unit for building, transport, and production, whereas the educational units might depend on language ... The national areas might, for instance, have different boundaries from those of the health areas, insofar as sharper geographical frontiers of mores, customs, outlook, legal systems, etc., show themselves. They need not at all be frontiers of sovereignty under armed protection. Only in this way will the wolfish nature of states be eradicated, end quote. What is significant about Neurath's version is that it retains a clear distinction between the flourishing of associations and the flourishing of exchange relations, a distinction that many recent uses of the term, quote, civil society, end quote, have blurred. He avoids the assumption which has dogged much 20th century political thought and action, and we must choose either state planning or the, quote, internationalism of the, quote, money order, end quote, end quote. Indeed, Neurath tends to turn that point around, that the monetary order itself tends to produce certain kinds of uniformity. The significance of institutional and cultural pluralism in a socialist economy is central to Neurath's defense of associationalism. Quote, within the framework of a deliberately devised economic plan, it is possible for forms of economy of various kinds to exist without being forced into competition. Craft cooperatives, special settlements with shared work, industrial associations. In this way, perhaps, the intolerance of the market economy will be overcome, which destroyed everything that stood against, quote, laissez-faire, end quote, and the wish of expansion for capitalist gain. Manchester liberalism, treated community and guild movements with contempt, end quote. The claims about cultural uniformity of the market are reiterated in a criticism of the lack of pluralism found in many models of socialism. Quote, should China, India, Central Africa really get one and the same socialism? Each comparative study of different orders of life teaches us that it was the tendency to organize the economy in all civilizations after the same pattern which made the free market society so much hated. If socialism should bring liberation, it must be joined by tolerance. Socialism must do justice to the differences in civilizations and fit each one into the economic plan and the administrative economy in its own way, end quote. Neurath defended an associational socialism without markets in which unification of the economy was to be married with decentralization of decision-making. Quote, the economic plan requires the economy to be unified. This does not mean that all decision-making is centralized, as many social democrats wish. It is enough if a central body ensures that independent decisions by various economic groups will fit into the general plan, end quote. Of course, that position raises its own difficulties. Within a non-market setting, how are problems of coordination to be overcome without extensive and excessive centralization of powers? The problems of combining coordination of activities with their self-administration and of realizing institutional pluralism were recurrent ones in Neurath's practical engagement in social action. Neurath was involved in various social experiments, but three in particular are relevant here. The socialization plans in post-war Bavaria. I believe Neurath was was appointed like the head of economics or economic planning in the short-lived Bavarian Socialist Republic in I believe it came to existence in 1919. Led by Kurt Eisner, and I believe, who else? What's the guy's fucking name? Gustav Landauer, I believe, was like the Minister of Culture or something like that. I'm not sure. That might all be wrong, but I think Kurt Eisner had some weird death story. He was assassinated, but the guy who assassinated him had some weird story. Like, I'm not going to repeat it because it's controversial, and I'm not sure if it's true, so I'm not going to say if it's the case. Neurath was involved in various social experiments, but three in particular are relevant here: the socialization plans in post-war Bavaria, the housing movement in post-war Vienna, and the unity of science movement in the 1930s. Each has relevance to Neurath's model of non-market associational socialism. If there is a movement in Neurath's thought, it is the movement towards increasing decentralization, which in turn reflects historical experiences. Socialization plans in post-war Bavaria. Neurath's first and most direct practical engagement in socialization was his involvement as director of socialization in Bavaria during the post-war revolutionary period. Neurath's total socialization plans were radical in being committed to a rapid movement towards a planned moneyless economy in kind. Indeed, in his Bavarian plans, socialization in this sense took priority over the abolition of private property. A feature of the plans was the commitment to pluralism in the forms that non-capitalist organization could take within a general system of central indicative planning. Quote, "The program of socialization here discussed makes an attempt at a simultaneous realization of socialism, solidarism, and communism, ... It provides for cooperatives for peasants and craftsmen, for collectivist settlements on a communist basis, and for large-scale socialist production in agriculture and industry to exist side by side, in order to do justice to their different aspirations to realize a collective economy in their own way, ... Mere majority decision will give way to an economic tolerance that can support several non-capitalist forms of economy simultaneously," end quote. The terms, quote, "communism" and, quote, "socialism" here have a particular idiosyncratic meaning, associated with Tony's distinction between Gemeinschaft, which is a community, and Gesellschaft, which is a society. I'm super smart because I know all that, but, you know. I need to fucking learn German. I need to get my act together. Communism refers to socialization within the context of Gemeinschaft, in which the relations are constituted by habit and custom. A significant feature of Neurath's socialization plans was the degree to which the habitual and customary were not eliminated. Socialism refers to socialization within the context of the more formal relations of Gesellschaft. Solidarism refers to the various cooperative movements. Central to that institutional pluralism was the role of associations of producers. While Neurath retained the commitment to a planning agency, a central economic administration, the attention was that it left autonomy to lower associations. Quote, "Wherever possible, the realization of the measures to be taken would be left to non-bureaucratic associations that administrate themselves. These associations are to be consulted in the course of determining the economic plan and have a vote in it. They may be of different kinds. Craftsmen and peasants may be grouped in cooperatives, which take responsibility for the raw materials and additional inputs and ensure that the final product will be available to all people, ... Special organizations would have to encompass the big production plants, ... The cooperatives of the craftsmen and the associations of industry would, just like the peasant cooperatives and the agricultural associations, be united in national associations that control the production from the raw material till the end product. For instance, the National Association for Construction Works would comprise the production of construction materials, the administration of building land, and the actual construction works," end quote. Alongside these production associations, Neurath also allowed for a role for the workers' councils within the overall organizations, which, significantly for Neurath, were to include not just factory workers, but also representatives of women involved in domestic labor and those unable to work. Um, yeah, that's actually an interesting thing that I haven't really like thought about, and maybe it exists and doesn't. But I was curious, like, is there research or work done, um, that kind of like compares the so-called pure council system of Richard Müller, who was a revolutionary shop steward, I believe in Berlin, but in Germany at least, and Neurath's in-kind economy. If there's like been work trying to elaborate the relationship between those conceptions of socialism. Um, Very interesting stuff. Still coming down back from this flu. Um, Neurath's socialization plans during the Bavarian Revolution were never realized. However, his subsequent reflections on the experiences engaged with issues of planning without centralization of knowledge and decision making. The housing movement in post war Vienna. A second major activity, which is reflected in his many references to the example of construction and housing in his socialization writings, was his involvement in the housing movement in post war Vienna. On returning to Vienna after the failure of the Bavarian Revolution, Neurath became secretary of the Research Institute for Social Economy, which aimed to gather information for the development of socialist economy. Through the Institute's activities, Neurath became Secretary General of the League of Settlers and Small Gardeners in 1921. The settlement movement grew during the food shortages at the end of and just after the First World War, when many in the urban population established small gardens for food and livestock at the outskirts of the city. Through local organizations of mutual aid, these grew into small garden cities. In 1916, it had only 2,000 members in 13 local organizations. In Neurath's first report on the movement, it had 30,000 members in 230 local organizations, later growing to a movement of some 50,000. While the statutes of the movement stated that it, quote, excluded, end quote, party politics, it contained various socialist, anarchist, communist, and conservative forces, often in conflict with each other. The Social Democratic Party, after an initial period of skepticism, was supportive, and the land administration provided support through leases on land and the provision of water and the like. The experiment was successful, although eventually incorporated into the larger social democratic housing projects in post war Vienna. Sorry, this is making me think of something that's like kind of like a funny statement. Um, I don't know if you know who Timothy Snyder is, but he's like a historian of Eastern Europe, and he wrote a famous book called The Bloodlands, which is kind of about like all of the um, trauma that took place in Eastern Europe, say between in the first you know fucking I don't know 50 years of the 20th century. But he was talking about in this particular thing he was talking about Stalinist Russia, and he said something. Some people. He's not. I don't think he's a radical in any mean, but he's probably like a social democrat. I'm not sure actually what he is, but it doesn't fucking matter. It's just a historian guy, and but he said something to the effect of like, people would like to blame Marxism for Stalinism. It says, but the Marxists came to power in Vienna, and what Vienna got was free public swimming pools. I'm not sure what talk he said that in, but it was just kind of like in a Q&A or something like that. It wasn't like a profound statement or anything, but it was kind of like a joke. But I think it's actually It's an interesting thought, especially because someone whose research is so much, about all the fucking atrocities committed, in the Soviet Union by the Soviet state, in that part of the part where it existed, in the places where it existed, um, you know, might take on a very, reactionary stance towards, leftist politics in general. But I thought that was a funny, pithy critique of that. It seems like he didn't subscribe to that, but I don't know what his actual politics are. But a feature of Neurath's role in the organization is that he argued for maintaining historically given cooperatives and associations of farmers and workers within the larger central socialist organization that would coordinate the movement. The problem was one of coordinating activities that were self-managed while maintaining social ownership against tendencies within the movement towards privatization and maintaining some degree of discipline in the coordination of the various activities that rendered it a cooperative movement. Clearly, it differed from the larger socialization plans of the Bavarian Republic in its scale. It involved coordination of cooperatives with specific housing and land use aims, not the coordination of an entire economy. However, such associational orders for Neurath formed the basis of a wider non-market socialization of the economy. The unity of science movement in the 1930s. The concern with sustaining coordination with self-organized activities also pervaded the third social movement in which Neurath was centrally involved, that for the unity of the sciences. To call the unity of science movement a social movement might look an oddity, and that is certainly not how the movement has been normally portrayed. Subsequent accounts of the movement have tended to present the program as a form of positivistic reductionism, which died with one of the last publications of the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science, Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The image is an error. The image is in error. While reductionism was not absent among all those involved in the unity of science movement, it was already rejected by many, in particular Neurath. Quote, would it not be preferable to treat all statements and all sciences as coordinated, and to abandon for good the traditional hierarchy, physical sciences, biological sciences, social sciences, and similar types of, quote, scientific pyramidism, end quote, Neurath. Neurath also rejected a second doctrine, which was often part of the subsequent image of the movement, the belief in a single unified method for the sciences. While Neurath rejected the view that there were fundamental differences between natural and social sciences, he was a pluralist about methods in sciences. The belief in the existence of a single method in science was a form of pseudo-rationalism, hence his opposition to both falsification and verification. Finally, there is far less of a break between sociology of science associated with Kuhn and the earlier sociological accounts of Neurath than is often supposed. The central project of the Unity of Science movement was a social project, that of coordinating the activities and output of the scientific community, both as a part of a general democratic movement for social change and as a means of coordinating knowledge for social planning. The intent of the project was the realization of the coordination of different disciplines. The project addressed two social problems. The first is what Neurath calls the, quote, democratization of knowledge, end quote, that was central to Neurath's work from the cultural education movements of Red Vienna. His work on museums and visual education through isotypes belonged to the same social project. The second problem is the way that decisions about particular states of affairs draw on different sciences. This problem is central to any possibility of social planning that calls on various forms of knowledge. Neurath's response to the problem was a defense of a unity of language for the sciences, specifically of physicalism, the view that all statements in science be controllable by sentences containing terms that refer only to spatio-temporal particulars. In the work of Neurath, the orchestration of the sciences is taken to illustrate, quote, how much unity of action can result without any kind of authoritative integration, end quote. Science is integrated without any pyramidic organization. The model of orchestration of the kind one finds in the sciences reflects Neurath's vision of planning, particularly in his later writings, as a possible, quote, future order based not on, quote, state pyramidism, end quote, if that term may be accepted, but on, quote, overlapping institutions, end quote, which do not coincide with any, quote, hierarchic, end quote, world pattern, end quote. Whatever the plausibility of that vision, there is an important point here. The scientific community is an example of an international non-market order within existing economies. The scientific community offers one of the many examples of non-market coordination of knowledge and activities within existing market societies. It is a social achievement to which Neurath is right to draw attention. Sorry, it's gross. Liberation, pluralism, and the institutions of socialism. So we made deliberation, pluralism, and the institutions of socialism. The shared assumption of both Austrian and neoclassical economics that rational choice requires the use of market mechanisms and monetary measures remains at the core of current debates in environmental economics. The standard critical response to market solutions has been the shift from the market to the forum, to experiments in deliberative institutional frameworks for social choice. Deliberative models of democracy have recently enjoyed a justifiable revival. Against the market picture of democracy as a procedure for aggregating and effectively meeting the given preferences of individuals, it offers a model of democracy as a forum through which judgments and preferences are formed and altered through reasoned dialogue. In the context of public environmental choice, it has had particular power in criticism of market-based approaches to environmental choice. Market-based approaches to the resolution of value conflicts with the environment, to the resolution of value conflicts about the environment are reason blind. The strength and weakness of the intensity of a preference as measured by a person's willingness, quote, willingness to pay, end quote, at the margin for their satisfaction do count in a decision. The strength and weakness of the reasons for a preference do not. Preferences are treated as expressions of mere taste to be priced and weighed one with the other. Market approaches offer conflict resolution without rational assessment and debate. However, because environmental conflicts are open to reasoned debate, which aims to change preferences, not record preferences, it follows that different institutional forms are needed for environmental conflict resolution. Where conflict is open to reasoned adjudication, discursive institutions are the appropriate form for resolving the conflict. In practice, the revival of deliberative democracy has been expressed in the development of, quote, new, end quote, formal deliberative institutions, which are often presented as experiments in deliberative democracy. These include citizens' juries, citizens' panels, in-depth discussion groups, consensus conferences, roundtables, and, more problematically, focus groups. At the same time, at the level of decision-making tools, there have been attempts to develop multi-criteria decision aids that recognize the irreducibility of different dimensions of value involved in social choices. Where such multi-criteria decision aids have tended to be technocratic and expert-based in the past, the recent move has been to find ways of integrating them into deliberative institutional contexts. Sorry, one moment. How far can such experiments inform a model of future socialist society? To the extent that these experiments in deliberation are offered as purely political solutions in the absence of changes to economic institutions, there are two grounds for skepticism from socialists. The first appeals to well-worked socialist arguments against the purely formal equality involved in liberal institutions. While, quote, new, end quote, deliberative institutions are often presented as, quote, facilitating, quote, inclusive, quote, dialogue between equals, dialogue takes place against the background of large asymmetries of social, institutional, and economic power. This has implications for the ways deliberative forums can operate. With informal deliberative forums, the capacity and confidence to speak differs across class, gender, and ethnicity. Just as willingness to pay is unevenly distributed, picking up inequalities of income, so also is willingness to say. I think it's... Just as unwillingness to pay is unevenly distributed, picking up inequalities of income, so is willingness to say. Moreover, deliberative institutions are open to being used strategically. Some of the new, quote, deliberative, end quote, institutions, in particular focus groups, are often employed in political practice to gather information of likely responses to different policies, not in order to foster public deliberation, but rather to anticipate and forestall it. The origin of the focus group technique lies, after all, in market research. Where deliberation is public, power is exercised in the framing of issues before discussion and in the choice of the constituency for debate. If effectively captured by powerful institutions, deliberative institutions provide strong legitimation tools. The purely formal equality of liberal institutions is not sufficient for the proper working of deliberative institutions. A rough equality in economic and social power is a necessary condition, and such equality requires shifts away from current patterns of ownership and control. This argument from deliberative ideals to the need for economic and social equality strikes me as entirely right. In the context of social and economic equality, a more Athenian model of democracy in which deliberative institutions are chosen by lot, such as the citizen's jury, could play a wider role in economic and political life. It offers the possibility of a social order of equals in which each takes turn in positions of power where, in the phrase of Aristotle, quote, they rule and are ruled in turn, end quote. A purely political model of deliberation is also open to a second objection concerning the split between citizen and market actor that it assumes. One version of this is in Karl Marx's On the Jewish Question. In the perfected democratic constitution, the individual lives in two worlds and two roles, as a citizen in the communal world of democracy and as a self-interested agent in the world of the market. Social emancipation requires the transformation of the economic realm of bringing the communal citizen down to earth in his everyday life, quote, when the real individual man reabsorbs in himself the abstract citizen, end quote. The division that Marx criticizes between, quote, citizen and, quote, market agent is assumed by many who advocate a deliberative response to environmental problems. Consider, for example, the distinction between the preferences that an individual has in the role of consumer and those that she has as a citizen drawn by Sagoff in his influential The Economy of the Earth. As a consumer, an individual expresses, quote, personal or self-regarding wants and interests, end quote. As a citizen, she expresses her, quote, judgments about what is right or good, end quote. For Sagoff, it is in the role of citizen that the individual deliberates about environmental goods. The mistake of market approaches to environmental problems is that they transform an issue that requires public deliberation by citizens into one to be resolved by consumer preferences. Sagoff's use of the distinction between citizen and consumer takes for granted the institutional context of different preference orders. That split is problematic. It is unclear just where and what the boundary of the political and the market is supposed to be, because there are very few economic decisions that do not have environmental consequences. Within the economic sphere itself, to leave the allocation of most resources to the market is incompatible with the realization of environmental goods. The market responds only to those preferences that can be articulated through acts of buying and selling. Hence the interest of the commercially inarticulate, both those who are contingently so, the poor, and those who are necessarily so, future generations and non-humans, cannot be adequately represented. Moreover, a competitive market economy is necessarily oriented towards the growth of capital, and therefore is incompatible with a sustainable economy. The idea that we can simply live in two worlds with the kind of preference schizophrenia that Sagoff assumes is untenable. Public deliberation needs to be taken into the economy itself. This case for bringing deliberative institutions into the economic realm is, however, open to two major objections. The first is a version of Hayek's epistemological criticisms of planned economies, which has recently been deployed by Hodgson against the possibility of a predominantly non-market economy coordinated by deliberative institutions. If there are forms of tacit or practical knowledge that cannot be passed on to a central planning system because they are not open to articulation, then neither will they be open to articulation in a deliberative setting. Hence, models of socialism that rely purely on deliberative institutions to coordinate activities will be open to some of the same objections made to the epistemic case against planning. The argument runs to the conclusion that any coordination of dispersed tacit knowledge requires mechanisms that, quote, rely to some significant extent on the market and the price mechanism, end quote. These epistemological arguments do point to limits to deliberative institutions as processes of social coordination and choice. However, they are not conclusive as arguments for a market as against deliberative institutional framework within economic life. First, social coordination does not require specifically market institutions. Indeed, the very examples that are normally employed to illustrate the significance of practical knowledge highlight this point. When Hodgson illustrates the role of practical knowledge, he turns, as did Hayek, to Polanyi's claim that, quote, all scientific advances and technological innovations are bound up with tacit knowledge, end quote. Hodgson is right to do so. The coordination of scientific knowledge, both tacit and articulated, is one of the institutional achievements of the modern world. However, as support for the need for markets and prices to coordinate tacit knowledge, the example fails. The public scientific community is one of the great examples of a predominantly non-market social order within the modern world. The danger in the current introduction of market mechanisms into public science is that it will reduce rather than increase the rate of innovation. Conflicts around the development of new intellectual property regimes center on the control of knowledge crucial to innovation. More generally, the coordination of knowledge, tacit and articulated, is a ubiquitous problem that exists at all points in the social and economic order. As knowledge has come to the center of economic life in the modern world, the management of the distribution of unarticulated knowledge throughout organizations of various kinds without its loss has become an increasingly important task. The market is not needed for coordination, and, as the case of science shows, can become a hindrance. There exist various levels of coordination throughout the economy in different institutional forms, our knowledge of which is often practical and unarticulated. While it may be true that deliberative institutions alone cannot realize coordination, deliberation clearly can have a coordinating role within a wider context of practically and institutionally embodied knowledge. Consider again the case of the scientific community. Just as the market is not needed for coordination, neither is there reason to assume that dialogical forms of coordination necessarily reduce the use of local and tacit knowledge. A second and more powerful objection to the position Marx defends in On the Jewish Question is the institutional monism it involves, a monism that has been a feature of much socialist thinking over the last century. Whatever the specific problems with market economies, the assumption that the division between the private person and the public citizen is one that should simply be overcome is problematic. However, the criticism of institutional monism also cuts in the opposite direction. The recognition of the need for institutional pluralism has been a central point in ecological criticism of the market economy. Ecological knowledge is embodied in particular practices and traditions that cannot be articulated and that globalized markets undermine. This point appeals to an argument for pluralism within the socialist tradition that recent resistance to globalization has brought back to the fore. Thus, for example, a rejection of the monism of both free market liberalism and technocratic models of socialism was central to Neurath's work and, hence, Neurath's defense of, quote, economic tolerance that can support several non-capitalist forms of economy simultaneously, end quote. There are good epistemological reasons for such tolerance. Different forms of knowledge are embodied in different social practices and institutions. There are also reasons to do with the nature of different goods. For example, given their different natures, health, love, and the recognition of the worth of a scientific achievement should not be distributed by identical institutional principles. The first follows need. The second, the fortunes of kinship and affection. The third, merit. While market mechanisms are inadequate, neither is there a single socialist principle of distribution that applies to all. The defense of institutional pluralism needs stressing in current debates. There is a tendency among socialists to think in terms of some single model of social relations, and this is as true for decentralized planning as it is for centralized planning. There is a pluralism of non-market forms of social and economic relations, such as gifts, public networks of recognition, scientific communities, kin relations, and cooperatives. It is a mistake in considering the future of socialism after the failure of centralized state economies to look for It is a mistake in deep breath. It is a mistake in considering the future of socialism after the failure of centralized state economies to look for the new model. Given the knowledge embodied in human traditions and practices, there are good epistemological grounds for skepticism about the attempt to reorganize all human activities on the basis of some general set of rational principles. As Hayek and Neurath both note, reason sees its maturity in the recognition of its own limits. Conversely, the significance of non-market orders that exist within contemporary society need to be recognized, and defended against market encroachment while remaining critical of their internal forms of power. Globalization has seen the geographical spread of commercial norms into communities, which retain non-market economic relations employing common property, mutual aid and gift, and for whom markets previously existed on the margins of their economic life. At the same time, in advanced market economies, there has been an expansion in the domains of goods and relations falling under market norms. Domains that were previously outside market norms, such as public science, access to information, control of agricultural and natural biodiversity, and bodily integrity, are being redefined as potential spheres of market exchange that are coming under new property rights regimes. Environmental goods are increasingly coming under the norms of market exchange in both these senses. A link exists between current resistance to the spread of market norms and property rights, keeping knowledge free, sustaining islands of cooperative activity, maintaining access to environmental goods, and the possibility of a socialist future. The significance of the recent anti-capitalist movement against neoliberal globalization has been the defense of non-market institutional and cultural forms against the spread of market norms. Socialists need not just recreate utopian visions, but build on existing non-market orders to remind ourselves of the existence of social relations and networks, both local and global, that have developed outside market norms. The future of socialism is not ultimately compromised by the possibility of feasible alternatives to the capitalist economy. Although the unattractiveness of the putative alternatives in Eastern Europe and Asia that went under the title of socialism has left its legacy, the problems come increasingly from a form of social lock-in that the capitalist market order survives because the capitalist market order becomes so tied into all human relationships that construction of an alternative becomes increasingly difficult to build or even imagine. In that context, the defense of existing non-market orders becomes part of the project of maintaining the possibility of an alternative. Thanks for listening.